September 19th, 1943. The skies above Vella Lavella in the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai rolled his Mitsubishi A6M Zero into a climbing turn, his eyes scanning the crystalline Pacific sky through the optical gunsight mounted before his face. Brilliant sunlight glinted off the cockpit canopy. Below, the jungle stretched in an endless carpet of green toward beaches where American landing craft were pushing ashore. The air smelled of salt, engine oil, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sakai's mission was precise. Intercept the enemy fighters protecting the invasion fleet, engage them in close combat where the Zero's legendary maneuverability would decide the outcome, drive them from the sky. At 26 years old, Sakai was among Japan's elite pilots, with 64 confirmed victories. He had survived China, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Rabaul. He knew his aircraft intimately, every vibration of its Nakajima Sakai engine, every nuance of its controls. The Zero responded to his touch like an extension of his own body. Then he spotted them. 4 aircraft approaching from the southeast at 11,000 feet. Large, brutish-looking machines with twin booms and ungainly profiles compared to the elegant lines of his Zero. Grumman F6F Hellcats. Sakai had encountered them twice before. They were fast in a dive, difficult to catch when they chose to run, but clumsy in a turning fight. He pushed his throttle forward and began his approach, confident in the mathematics of aerial combat that had kept him alive through 2 years of war. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans flew. Get inside their turning circle, bring the Type 99 20mm cannon to bear, fire a short burst into the engine or cockpit, move to the next, target. Simple. Proven. Effective. What happened in the next 90 seconds would fundamentally alter Sakai's understanding of aerial warfare and reveal a truth that would haunt Japanese pilots throughout the final 2 years of the Pacific War. A truth about industrial capacity, about firepower, about the collision between traditional military doctrine and modern total war. The lead Hellcat pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Westbrook of the 39th Fighter Squadron, spotted Sakai's Zero climbing toward his formation. Rather than attempting to turn with the Japanese fighter, a contest he knew he would lose, Westbrook pushed his control column forward and dove, building speed. Then he pulled up sharply into a climbing attack that brought him head-on toward Sakai's aircraft. The closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour. Sakai saw the Hellcat's wings light up with muzzle flashes, not the brief sparkling bursts he was accustomed to seeing from American fighters. Not the careful, rationed shots of pilots conserving ammunition. This was something different, something that violated every principle of aerial gunnery Sakai had learned. A continuous, rippling wall of fire that seemed impossibly intense. 8 streams of tracers, glowing red-orange even in bright daylight, converged on his Zero-like fingers reaching across the sky. His aircraft shuddered violently. Something massive struck the engine, cowling with a sound like a hammer hitting sheet metal. Then the left wing, then the canopy frame. Metal fragments filled the cockpit. Sakai felt a sharp pain across his forehead as something hot sliced past his face. Blood ran into his right eye. The control stick went slack in his hands, unresponsive. The engine seized with a grinding shriek that vibrated through the entire airframe. Oil splattered across the windscreen. Sakai's Zero, which moments before had been a responsive extension of his will, became a falling coffin of torn aluminum and shattered systems. He reached for the canopy release, fighting against the G-forces as the aircraft began its death spiral, managed to bail out at 4,000 feet, watched his Zero tumble into the jungle below, trailing smoke. American PT boats picked him up 3 hours later, delirious from blood loss and shock. During his initial interrogation aboard USS Fletcher 2 days later, Sakai kept returning to one detail that seemed to have imprinted itself on his consciousness with traumatic clarity. The intensity of the gunfire, the weight of it, the way his aircraft had simply disintegrated under fire that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He had been shot down before, had witnessed other aircraft destroyed in combat. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the concentrated violence of what he now understood the Americans called a head-on pass from a fighter carrying 6 50-caliber machine guns. The interrogation officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Stassen, noted Sakai's repeated emphasis on American firepower. Through an interpreter, Sakai asked the same question 3 times. "How many guns?" "6 guns," Stassen replied each time. 6 guns, each firing approximately 400 rounds, all mounted in the wings, all firing simultaneously. Sakai seemed unable to comprehend how an aircraft could mount such weaponry and still fly effectively. His Zero carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannon, weapons he had considered adequate, even superior in the case of the cannon. The idea that American fighters mounted 6 or even 8 heavy machine guns, each firing projectiles nearly half an inch in diameter at rates exceeding 750 rounds per minute, seemed to violate his understanding of aircraft design and combat doctrine. Sakai's experience was not unique. By September 1943, Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific were encountering American fighters whose firepower exceeded anything they had faced in the war's early campaigns. What followed was not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual, psychologically devastating process of understanding that would transform confident warriors into men who knew with absolute certainty that they were flying inferior machines against an enemy whose approach to aerial combat was fundamentally different from their own. To understand the psychological shock Japanese pilots experienced, one must first understand the doctrinal foundation upon which their confidence rested. The Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to fighter design emerged from specific strategic requirements and a particular philosophy of aerial combat that seemed validated by early war successes. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, which entered service in 1940, represented the culmination of Japanese fighter doctrine. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi under requirements demanding unprecedented range, maneuverability, and climb rate, the Zero achieved its performance through radical weight reduction. The aircraft weighed just 3,740 pounds empty, achieved through eliminating armor protection for the pilot, omitting self-sealing fuel tanks, and using the lightest possible airframe construction consistent with structural integrity. The armament reflected deliberate choices rooted in Japanese combat experience over China and careful analysis of what pilots needed to succeed in aerial combat. 2 Type 97 7.7mm machine guns, essentially license-built British Vickers guns, were mounted in the cowling, firing through the propeller arc. These provided ranging fire, allowing pilots to walk their aim onto targets. 2 Type 99 20mm cannon, one in each wing, provided the knockout blow. Each cannon carried 100 rounds. Japanese doctrine emphasized accuracy over volume of fire. Pilots trained extensively in deflection shooting, learning to place precise bursts rather than hosing targets with sustained camotation. Fire. The strategy was deliberate and based on the limitations of the weapons system. At typical engagement ranges of 100 to 200 meters, a single well-placed 20mm shell could tear apart control surfaces, ignite fuel tanks, or kill pilots outright. The explosive shells carried enough destructive force to end fights with a single hit. This approach worked spectacularly in the war's opening campaigns. Over China, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed to validate every design decision. The aircraft's maneuverability was genuinely revolutionary. At speeds below 250 miles per hour, nothing could turn with a Zero. Its roll rate, particularly to the left, was exceptional. Its climb rate exceeded any contemporary fighter. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, forcing opponents into turning engagements where superior agility decided outcomes within seconds. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's third-ranking ace, later described the Zero's handling characteristics in terms approaching reverence. The aircraft responded instantly to control inputs. It could sustain turns at angles of attack that would stall other fighters. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could execute maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. Hanging on its propeller, flicking into snap rolls, reversing direction with minimal altitude loss, The psychological dimension was equally important. Japanese naval aviators underwent training that was deliberately brutal, designed to produce pilots of exceptional skill, but limited numbers. Training emphasized individual combat prowess, situational awareness, and the aggressive spirit captured in the concept of saishin, often translated inadequately as fighting spirit. Pilots were taught that superior skill and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The Zero's design validated this belief, providing a machine that rewarded pilot ability and punished hesitation. American fighters encountered in the early war seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions. The Brewster F-2A Buffalo, Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, and early Grumman F-4F Wildcat all suffered severe disadvantages in turning combat with Zeros. American pilots who attempted traditional dogfighting tactics died quickly. Japanese pilots accumulated kills, gained confidence, and came to believe their approach to aerial warfare was superior. But while Japanese pilots dominated Pacific skies in the first 18 months of war, American tacticians, engineers, and industrial planners were absorbing lessons that would reshape the nature of aerial combat. They were asking different questions, making different calculations, reaching different conclusions about how to win air superiority. The American approach to fighter armament developed along different lines, driven by different priorities and different industrial realities. In the late 1930s, as war loomed, American military planners studied air combat reports from the Spanish Civil War and the early phases of the Second World War in Europe. They reached conclusions that differed sharply from Japanese thinking. American doctrine emphasized standoff firepower. Rather than closing to point-blank range, American tacticians wanted pilots who could engage effectively at 200, 300, even 400 meters. This required weapons that could deliver many bullets over sustained periods, increasing the probability of hits at longer ranges, where pilot skill and split-second timing mattered less than sheer volume of fire. The solution was the Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun, a weapon that had been designed in the 1920s by John Moses Browning and refined through years of development. By the late 1930s, the 50 caliber Browning represented a mature, reliable weapons system that offered several crucial advantages. First, it fired a large, heavy bullet, actually half an inch in diameter, weighing approximately 1 2/3 ounces at extremely high velocity. These bullets could penetrate aircraft structures, engines, and even light armor. They didn't rely on explosive charges to cause damage. The kinetic energy alone was sufficient to destroy vital components or kill crew members. A single 50 caliber round carried the destructive power of a small hammer striking at 3,000 feet per second. Second, the gun was mechanically reliable. It functioned in extreme cold, desert heat, and humid tropical conditions. It resisted jamming even when exposed to dust, sand, or salt spray. Pilots could depend on it, absolutely. When they pulled the trigger, the gun fired. This reliability became increasingly important as the war progressed and maintenance conditions deteriorated in forward areas. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the gun could sustain fire for extended periods. The 50 caliber Browning could fire 750 to 850 rounds per minute continuously, limited only by ammunition supply and barrel heating. In practical terms, this meant a pilot could hold the trigger down for 5, 10, even 15 seconds in a single burst without mechanical failure. American fighter designers embraced this weapon enthusiastically. The early war models, like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, carried 6 50 caliber guns. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its unusual twin-boom design, concentrated 4 50 caliber guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose, allowing devastating accuracy since all weapons fired from the same point with no convergence issues. But it was the later generation of American fighters, entering service in 1943, that would fundamentally change the tactical calculus of Pacific air combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero, mounted 6 50 caliber guns with 400 rounds per gun. The mathematical implications were staggering. An F-6F Hellcat, firing all 6 guns, delivered approximately 100 rounds per second into a target area. Each gun could sustain fire for 30 seconds before exhausting its ammunition supply. This meant a 2-second burst delivered 200 rounds, a 5-second burst, 500 rounds. The weight of metal alone was crushing. A P-47 Thunderbolt with its 8 guns could deliver 130 rounds per second. Its total ammunition capacity of 2,800 rounds meant it could fire in sustained bursts, totaling 21 seconds. No Japanese pilot who survived an encounter with a Thunderbolt's full firepower ever forgot it. To Japanese pilots trained to fire short, precise bursts, this volume of fire seemed wasteful, even profligate. It violated principles of ammunition conservation drilled into them through training. But American industrial capacity made such apparent waste irrelevant. American factories produced .50 caliber ammunition in quantities that seemed unlimited by Japanese standards. American carriers and air bases stockpiled hundreds of thousands of rounds. American pilots never worried about running out. The disparity in armament philosophy reflected deeper differences in how the two nations approached warfare. Japanese doctrine emphasized the quality of individual warriors, the importance of training and spirit, the value of precision over volume. This worked brilliantly when the gap in material resources was modest and when pilot skill could compensate for technological limitations. American doctrine emphasized industrial capacity, standardization, and overwhelming firepower. Build weapons that were reliable rather than perfect. Produce them in quantities that allowed generous margins of safety. Train pilots to acceptable standards rather than elite levels, then give them machines that multiplied their effectiveness. Value consistency over exceptional skill. By mid-1943, these different philosophies were colliding in Pacific skies with results that shook Japanese confidence to its core. What Japanese pilots encountered was not merely superior weaponry, but an entirely different conception of how technology and industrial power could be applied to warfare. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and a key architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized the implications early. In a July 1943 report to Combined Fleet Headquarters, Genda wrote with unusual bluntness about the firepower gap. He noted that American fighters were destroying Japanese aircraft at ranges where Japanese weapons were marginally effective. He observed that a single American fighter could generate more firepower in one pass than an entire squadron of Zeros firing simultaneously. He concluded that without fundamental changes in Japanese aircraft design and manufacturing, pilot skill alone could not overcome the growing American advantage. Genda's report was classified and seen by few officers. Its recommendations, which included immediate development of heavily armed Japanese fighters and expansion of ammunition production, were noted but not acted upon with the urgency he advocated. By the time Japanese industry began producing improved fighters with heavier armament, it was far too late to affect the war's outcome. For pilots like Sakai, recovering from his wounds aboard the Fletcher, the implications were already clear. The war he had trained for, the war of individual skill and aircraft maneuverability, was ending. A new war was beginning, one where industrial capacity and firepower would matter more than any amount of courage or training. Through the interpreter, Sakai asked Lieutenant Commander Stassen one more question. How many of these fighters, the ones with 6 guns, does America have? Stassen consulted production figures before answering. We've produced approximately 4,000 Hellcats so far. Production is accelerating. We expect to build 12,000 before the war ends. Sakai sat in silence for a long moment. 12,000 fighters, each carrying 6 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 2,400 rounds. The mathematics were crushing. His entire understanding of aerial warfare, built over years of training and combat, was crumbling. He had one more question. And ammunition? How much do you have? Stassen smiled grimly. Enough. We have more than enough. That answer, more than any tactical briefing or intelligence report, captured the essential reality Japanese pilots would face for the rest of the war. America had more than enough. More fighters, more guns, more ammunition, more of everything that industrial warfare required. The sky, which had once belonged to the Zero and the skilled pilots who flew it, now belonged to whoever could project the most firepower into the air. And in that contest, there was no comparison. For Japanese aviation, the turning point was not a single dramatic battle, but a slow, grinding realization spreading from pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, across the entire Pacific theater. American fighters were not just better armed. They represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare that Japanese industry and doctrine were unprepared to counter. By October 1943, reports from frontline units began reflecting this new reality with stark honesty. Fighter pilots described American aircraft that could absorb dozens of hits from 7.7mm machine guns without going down. They reported enemy fighters that maintained formation after taking direct hits from 20mm cannon shells. They documented engagements where American fighters executed diving attacks, fired continuous bursts lasting 5 or 6 seconds, and departed before Japanese pilots could bring their canister, own weapons to bear. The psychological impact extended beyond simple combat losses. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe their skills, and spirit gave them decisive advantages. They had witnessed early war successes that confirmed this belief. Now they faced opponents whose material superiority rendered many of their trained techniques irrelevant. Traditional Japanese tactics emphasized close-range combat, tight turns, and precise gunnery. American tactics increasingly emphasized standoff attacks, high-speed passes, and overwhelming firepower. The two approaches rarely met on equal terms. American fighters dictated the terms of engagement, choosing when to attack, from what angle, at what speed. Japanese fighters, slower in a dive and less heavily armed, found themselves unable to force turning fights where their advantages mattered. Veteran pilots like Sakai could adapt, could learn new techniques, could survive through skill and experience. But Japan's pool of veteran pilots was shrinking rapidly. Every month, more experienced airmen died or were too badly wounded to return to combat. Replacements arrived with fewer training hours, less refined skills, and no time to learn from mistakes. By late 1943, Japanese Navy pilots averaged approximately 500 hours of flight training before entering combat. By mid-1944, that figure had dropped to 300 hours. By early 1945, new pilots arrived at frontline units with as little as 100 hours of total flight experience, much of it in obsolete training aircraft that barely prepared them for high-performance fighters. These inexperienced pilots faced American aviators who averaged 600 hours of training, flew superior aircraft, and operated under tactical doctrines specifically designed to minimize the importance of individual pilot skill. The result was predictable and devastating. Japanese losses accelerated. Kill ratios shifted dramatically in favor of American forces. Air superiority, once Japanese, became American. The firepower advantage American fighters enjoyed was not the only factor in this shift, but it was central and visible. Japanese pilots could see the muzzle flashes from 8 guns. They could count the tracer streams converging on their aircraft. They could watch their wingmen's planes disintegrate under the weight of fire that seemed impossible by their standards. The psychological impact of facing such firepower, knowing their own weapons could not respond in kind, created a sense of helplessness that eroded morale more effectively than any number of tactical defeats. The transition from Japanese air superiority to American dominance played out across countless small engagements throughout late 1943 and 1944. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. Japanese pilots, flying lighter, more maneuverable aircraft with limited armament, faced American fighters that were heavier, faster in a dive, and armed with firepower that seemed inexhaustible. One engagement in particular, over Rabaul in November 1943, illustrated the new reality with brutal clarity. 24 Zeros from the 26th Air Flotilla intercepted a formation of 18 F-6F Hellcats, escorting bombers targeting Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. The Zero pilots, most with over a year of combat experience, employed standard tactics. They climbed to gain altitude advantage, then dove on the American formation, attempting to break it apart and force individual dogfights. The Hellcat pilots, briefed on Zero capabilities and trained in new tactical doctrines, refused to engage on Japanese terms. Instead of turning to meet the diving Zeros, they maintained formation and used their superior diving speed to extend away from attackers. When Zeros pursued, attempting to close to gun range, Hellcat pilots executed a maneuver that was becoming standard. They pulled up sharply from their dive, bleeding speed, and allowed pursuing Zeros to overshoot. As each Zero flashed past, unable to follow the high-speed climbing turn, it became vulnerable for 2 or 3 seconds. In those seconds, Hellcat pilots fired, not short, careful bursts, long, sustained fire. 6 guns per aircraft, 2,400 rounds total, all converging on a single target at ranges of 100 to 200 meters. First Lieutenant James Sweat, flying with Fighting Squadron 17, described what happened next in his after-action report. "I got on the tail of a Zero that had overshot Lieutenant Davis. Range about 150 yards. Fired a 3-second burst, all 6 guns. Saw strikes all over the fuselage and wings. Pieces came off. Left wing folded up. Aircraft went into a spin and crashed into the harbour. Estimated I fired approximately 360 rounds total." 360 rounds, from a single pilot, in a single 3-second burst, against an aircraft that weighed 3,740 pounds and carried no armour protection. The Zero, which might have survived a few 20mm hits if they missed vital areas, could not survive sustained 50 caliber fire. The kinetic energy alone was overwhelming. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 14 Zeros had been shot down. 2 Hellcats were damaged but returned to base. No American aircraft were lost. The kill ratio, 7-to-1, was becoming typical for encounters between Zeros and late-war American fighters. Japanese after-action reports from Rabaul reflected growing desperation. Pilots described their weapons as inadequate. They noted that even when they successfully attacked American fighters, achieving good firing solutions and placing accurate bursts, their targets often survived. The 7.7mm machine guns lacked penetrating power against American armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Even the 20mm cannon, while deadly when hits, landed, carried so little ammunition that pilots often exhausted their supply without achieving kills. Captain Masatake Okumiya, serving as operations officer for the 26th Air Flotilla, wrote in his diary about the psychological toll of these engagements. "Our pilots are brave. They press attacks with determination. But bravery is not enough when the enemy aircraft can absorb hits that would destroy our fighters. When enemy firepower can destroy us in seconds while our weapons require sustained fire to achieve damage, the mathematics are against us. We kill 1 enemy aircraft for every 7 we lose. At this rate, we will have no pilots left by spring." Okumiya's prediction proved accurate. By March 1944, the 26th Air Flotilla had been withdrawn from Rabaul, its effective strength reduced from 60 aircraft to fewer than 15. The surviving pilots were reassigned to home defense duties. Most would not survive the war. The firepower disparity became even more pronounced when Japanese pilots encountered the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which began operating in the Pacific Theater in mid-1943. The P-47 represented American fighter design philosophy taken to its logical extreme. It weighed over 8 tons fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 engine generated 2,000 horsepower, giving it excellent performance at high altitude and exceptional diving speed. But what impressed Japanese pilots most, what terrified them, was its armament. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 350 rounds per gun. Total ammunition capacity of 2,800 rounds. Combined rate of fire of 100 rounds per second. When a P-47 fired all 8 guns simultaneously, the weight of metal leaving the aircraft was staggering. 13 pounds per second, nearly 800 pounds per minute. Japanese ground forces on islands like Bougainville, New Guinea, and later the Marianas experienced P-47 ground attacks with particular horror. The standard P-47 strafing run began at approximately 8,000 feet. The pilot would roll into a 60-degree dive, building speed, the distinctive whine of the turbo supercharger growing louder. At approximately 3,000 feet, still diving, still accelerating, the pilot would open fire. 8 streams of tracers, perfectly parallel, converged on the target area. The sound was beyond description. Not individual shots, but a sustained, grinding roar that vibrated in the chest and made thought impossible. The visual effect was equally overwhelming. Dust, coral, vegetation, structures, vehicles, all exploding upward in massive plumes as hundreds of rounds per second impacted. A typical strafing pass lasted 3 to 5 seconds. In that time, a P-47 could fire between 300 and 500 rounds, against infantry in trenches, against light vehicles, against supply dumps. The effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers who survived described a sensation of helplessness, of being subject to industrial-scale violence that no amount of courage or training could mitigate. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takada of the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Army, stationed on Okinawa in April 1945, experienced P-47 attacks repeatedly during the 3-month campaign. In an interview recorded decades after the war, Takada described his first encounter. The sound came first, a deep roar, mechanical, growing louder. Then we saw them, dark shapes against the clouds, diving. Someone shouted to take cover. We pressed ourselves into the trench walls. Then the firing started. I cannot adequately describe it. Imagine every machine gun you have ever heard, all firing at once, multiplied by 10. The noise was physical. It hurt. The ground shook. Coral dust filled the air so thick we could not see. Men were screaming, but I could not hear them over the guns. The trench 50 meters to our left simply ceased to exist. Coral and clay gazed upward, bodies tumbled through the air. This lasted perhaps 4 seconds, then silence, then the next aircraft, then the next. 12 aircraft in the formation, 12 passes, 48 seconds of continuous fire. Takada's unit, an infantry company of approximately 120 men, lost 37 killed in that single attack. 15 others were wounded. The position they had spent 2 weeks fortifying was rendered untenable in less than 1 minute. They withdrew that night. These experiences, repeated across the Pacific theater, created a psychological burden that Japanese military psychiatrists began documenting in late 1944. They termed it hostile fire syndrome, a condition characterized by heightened anxiety, inability to rest, exaggerated startle responses, and, in severe cases, complete psychological breakdown. What is significant is that the symptoms appeared with particular intensity among survivors of American air attacks, suggesting that the psychological impact of that specific combat experience was uniquely traumatic compared to other forms of warfare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The industrial mathematics behind American firepower became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By 1944, American factories were producing 50-caliber ammunition at rates exceeding 10 million rounds per month. This ammunition was shipped to forward bases throughout the Pacific in quantities that seemed incomprehensible by Japanese standards. A typical American fighter squadron, operating from a carrier or island base, might have access to 100,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition at any given time. This allowed pilots to fire generously, to expend hundreds of rounds per sortie without worrying about supply constraints. Japanese fighter squadrons, by contrast, operated under severe ammunition restrictions. A typical Zero pilot might have access to 680 rounds of 7.7mm ammunition and 200 rounds of 20mm cannon shells for an entire day of operations. Pilots were instructed to fire only when certain of hitting, to conserve ammunition for multiple engagements, to make every shot count. This disparity meant that even when Japanese pilots achieved tactical advantages, positioned themselves perfectly for attacks, executed flawless deflection shots, they often lacked sufficient ammunition to exploit opportunities. American pilots, facing no such constraints, could fire speculatively, could use tracer rounds to walk their aim onto targets, could expend ammunition to suppress enemy fire or damage enemy morale rather than only to achieve kills. The psychological impact of this disparity extended beyond individual combat experiences. Japanese pilots understood intellectually that they were fighting an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity. They knew that American factories produced more aircraft, more engines, more weapons than Japanese industry could match. But this knowledge remained abstract until they experienced its practical implications in combat. When a Japanese pilot watched an American fighter absorb hits that would have destroyed his Zero, then saw that same fighter return to base, be repaired overnight, and fly again the next day, the industrial gap became real. When he fired his last 20mm round, knowing he had no more, while American fighters continued firing in sustained bursts, the ammunition disparity became visceral. When he saw formations of 30 or 40 American fighters, knowing his own squadron could barely field 12 operational aircraft, the numerical superiority became undeniable. This progressive revelation, this gradual understanding that the war was lost not through any failure of courage or skill, but through simple industrial mathematics, appeared consistently in Japanese accounts from 1944 onward. It was not defeatism in the traditional sense. Many pilots continued fighting with remarkable determination, even after understanding that defeat was inevitable. But the psychological burden of fighting a war already lost, of dying in a cause already defeated, weighed heavily. By mid-1944, as American forces approached the Mariana Islands and the war moved closer to Japan's home islands, the firepower disparity reached its peak. American fighters now operated in overwhelming numbers. Raids involving 100 or more fighters became routine. Japanese defenders, struggling to field 20 or 30 operational aircraft, faced odds that made survival rather than victory the primary objective. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, illustrated the culmination of these trends. The Japanese Navy committed approximately 400 to 30 carrier aircraft to the battle, including its last remaining pool of experienced pilots. American forces defending the Marianas invasion fleet fielded approximately 900 carrier-based fighters, predominantly F-6F Hellcats. The battle lasted 2 days. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 375 aircraft. American losses totaled approximately 30 aircraft. The kill ratio, 12-1, represented the logical endpoint of the firepower and training disparities that had been developing since 1943. American Hellcat pilots, flying fighters armed with 650 caliber guns, with 400 rounds per gun, with reliable radios and effective tactics, destroyed Japanese air power in the Pacific theater as an effective fighting force. Survivors from the Japanese carrier aircraft who managed to return to their ships brought tales of overwhelming American firepower that shocked even veteran commanders. Pilots described engagements where they fired their cannon and machine guns at American fighters without visible effect, while single bursts from Hellcats destroyed Japanese aircraft. They reported American formations that seemed to fill the sky, with fighters attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, all firing sustained bursts that created walls of tracers through which no aircraft could pass. Lieutenant Commander Masatoshi Nakajima, who survived the battle flying a Zero from the carrier Zuikaku, later wrote about the experience with unusual candor. "We understood that afternoon that we could not win. Not this battle, not the war. The Americans had too many aircraft, too many guns, too much ammunition. Every advantage we once possessed, maneuverability, pilot skill, fighting spirit, became irrelevant against such material superiority. We were fighting with swords against machine guns. We were brave. We were skilled. But we were doomed." The Japanese Navy never recovered from the Philippine Sea losses. The mobile fleet returned to Japan, with only 35 operational aircraft remaining from the 400 that had departed. Surviving pilots were reassigned to land-based units or to training commands, where they prepared new pilots for combat they themselves could no longer face. The era of Japanese carrier aviation, which had begun so brilliantly at Pearl Harbor, ended in the Philippine Sea, destroyed not by tactical failures, but by overwhelming American firepower and industrial capacity. In the months following the Philippine Sea, as American forces continued their advance through the Pacific, Japanese aviation increasingly relied on land-based fighters operating from bases in the Philippines, Formosa, and eventually Japan itself. These units faced the same firepower disparities that had destroyed naval aviation. They employed the same tactics that had proved inadequate. They suffered the same overwhelming losses. By late 1944, Japanese fighter units were losing aircraft at rates exceeding production. Pilot losses were even more catastrophic. The training pipeline, never adequate to Japanese needs, collapsed under the strain of replacing hundreds of pilots killed monthly. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal training, flew 1 or 2 combat missions, and died. The cycle repeated itself across the entire Pacific theater. In October 1944, as American forces invaded the Philippines, Japan initiated kamikaze attacks as a deliberate tactical choice. The decision reflected, among other factors, a realistic assessment of what conventional fighter tactics could achieve against American firepower and numbers. If Japanese pilots could not survive long enough to achieve significant damage through conventional attacks, perhaps suicide attacks, accepting certain death in exchange for certain impact, offered better tactical returns. The logic was grim, but mathematically sound given Japanese circumstances. A conventional attack by a Zero against an American ship required the pilot to approach through defensive fire, achieve a good firing solution, release ordnance accurately, and escape. Each step offered opportunities for failure and for the superior American firepower to destroy the attacking aircraft. Survival rates for conventional attacks against well-defended American ships approached 0 by late 1944. A kamikaze attack simplified the problem. The pilot needed only to reach the target. Navigation and approach remained complex, but the final attack was reduced to basic physics. An aircraft carrying hundreds of pounds of explosives, flown into a ship at 300 miles per hour, would cause damage regardless of pilot skill. The aircraft became the weapon. The pilot's death became the delivery mechanism. From 1944 through the war's end, approximately 3,800 kamikaze sorties were flown. They sank approximately 50 American vessels and damaged several hundred more. The psychological impact on American sailors was significant, but the tactical impact on the war's outcome was negligible. American industrial capacity replaced damaged and destroyed ships faster than kamikazes could sink them. American firepower, both shipboard and from defending fighters, destroyed the majority of kamikaze aircraft before they reached targets. The firepower that had defeated conventional Japanese fighters proved equally effective against kamikaze attacks. American ships by 1945 carried vastly improved anti-aircraft armament. 5-inch guns with radar fire control and proximity-fused shells could engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards. 40mm and 20mm automatic cannon provided closer defense. Computer-directed fire control systems calculated lead and elevation automatically, increasing hit probability. Most importantly, American carriers fielded large numbers of fighters specifically tasked with combat air patrol. These Hellcats and Corsairs, armed with their 6 or 8 50 caliber guns, intercepted kamikaze aircraft before they reached the fleet. The result was a layered defense that destroyed most attackers well short of their targets. Those that penetrated fighter defenses faced shipboard guns that could put hundreds of shells into the air per minute. Japanese pilots who survived kamikaze training, then chose not to fly their final missions, described the psychological burden of watching wave after wave of young pilots depart, knowing none would return, knowing their sacrifice would not change the war's outcome. The kamikaze campaign represented many things, including the Japanese military's willingness to expend lives in mathematically futile gestures, but it also represented a final acknowledgement that conventional tactics against American firepower had failed so completely that suicide attacks seemed the only remaining option. By early 1945, as American forces approached Okinawa and prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, the firepower disparity between American and Japanese aircraft reached its widest point. American fighters now included the P-51 Mustang, F-4U Corsair, and later models of the Hellcat, all carrying 6 or 8 50 caliber guns with generous ammunition loads. Japanese defenders flew whatever aircraft remained operational, many with inexperienced pilots who had never faced American fighters before their first combat mission. The Okinawa campaign, lasting from April through June 1945, demonstrated the final evolution of American air power in the Pacific. Massive formations of American fighters flew continuous combat air patrols over the invasion fleet and the island itself. They engaged Japanese aircraft with overwhelming numerical superiority and firepower advantages that made individual combat encounters brief and one-sided. Japanese aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen faced ship-based anti-aircraft fire that had been refined through years of combat experience. Japanese losses during the Okinawa campaign exceeded 7,000 aircraft. American losses totaled approximately 763 aircraft, many to accidents or ground fire rather than aerial combat. The kill ratio exceeded 9-1, and would have been higher except that many Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could engage. For surviving Japanese pilots, Okinawa represented the culmination of the process that had begun at Rabaul and the Solomons 2 years earlier. The realization that courage and skill were insufficient against overwhelming material superiority. That the 850 caliber guns on American fighters symbolized an industrial capacity and military philosophy that Japanese forces could not counter. In the war's final months, as Japan prepared for invasion, remaining fighter units were held back for homeland defense. Pilots who had survived years of combat, who had witnessed the destruction of Japanese air power across the Pacific, waited in Japan for the final battle. They knew what they would face. They had seen the 8 streams of tracers from P-47 seconds. They had watched Hellcats destroy entire formations with sustained fire. They understood that the mathematics of aerial combat, when one side possessed overwhelming firepower advantages, left little room for individual heroism. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, followed by Japan's surrender, ended the war before the final air battles over Japan could be fought. Thousands of Japanese pilots, aircraft, and ground crews remained intact at war's end, never having faced the full fury of American air power operating from Japanese soil. Some historians have speculated about what those final battles might have looked like. The speculation is unnecessary. Okinawa provided the template. The outcomes would have been identical. Years after the war, as Japanese and American veterans participated in reunions and historical studies, many Japanese pilots reflected on what the American firepower advantage had meant psychologically. These reflections, preserved in interviews and memoirs, reveal consistent themes. Lieutenant Takada, the infantry officer who had survived P-47 attacks on Okinawa, settled in Osaka after the war, working as a clerk in a manufacturing company. He married, had children, and rarely spoke about his war experiences. But in the 1980s, as he approached 70 years old, he agreed to be interviewed by researchers studying the Pacific War's psychological impacts. The interview, preserved in university archives, revealed that the war's psychological wounds had never fully healed. Takada described still having nightmares about Okinawa, about the sound of P-47 engines, about watching the 8 lines of tracers descend. He admitted that he couldn't watch war movies, that aircraft noise still caused involuntary anxiety responses, that he avoided discussing the war because memories remained too painful. When asked what specific memories troubled him most, his answer was revealing. Not the deaths. I saw many men die. That was war. We expected death. What troubles me still is the helplessness. When the American fighters attacked, we could do nothing. Nothing. We could only wait and hope we survived. That feeling of being completely powerless, of knowing death might come any second and being unable to prevent it or fight it, that feeling never leaves. The interviewer asked. What made American air attacks worse than other combat experiences? Takada's response captured something essential. In ground combat, you can fight, you can shoot, you can move, you can help your comrades, you have agency. Is that the word? You can act. Against the American fighters, we had no agency. They decided when to attack, who to attack, for how long. We simply endured or died. A man needs to feel he can affect his fate. The American airplanes took that from us. This theme, the loss of agency, the inability to influence outcomes, appears repeatedly in veteran accounts of facing overwhelming American firepower. It wasn't just the killing that created trauma. It was the psychological experience of being rendered completely passive, of becoming merely a target rather than a combatant, of having one's trained military capabilities made irrelevant by the enemy's material superiority. When asked specifically about the 8-gun armament on American fighters, Takada's memory remained sharp despite the decades. 8 machine guns. We counted them. 8 streams of fire. Each airplane was like a company of soldiers firing at once, but faster, continuous. And they had so many bullets, we could not understand it. Our machine guns carried 100, maybe 200 rounds. We fired short, bursts to conserve ammunition. But the American airplanes fired continuously. How was it possible? Even decades later, with full knowledge of American industrial capacity and technological capabilities, Takada retained a sense of wonder, almost disbelief, at the sheer abundance that 8-gun armament represented. It violated his understanding, formed during wartime scarcity, of what was reasonable or possible in military equipment. The interviewer asked a final question. Looking back, what did the 850 caliber guns on American fighters represent to Japanese soldiers? Takada considered carefully before answering. They represented that we had already lost. Not just battles. The war. When a single airplane carries more firepower than an entire platoon, when that airplane has more ammunition than our company, when that airplane is just one of thousands, you understand that you are not fighting an army. You are fighting an industrial nation that can produce weapons faster than you can produce soldiers. We understood this intellectually from reports and briefings, but seeing it, experiencing it, the 8 machine guns firing until the sky itself seemed full of bullets, that made it real, that made it certain. We had lost before we ever began. This realization, that the war was lost not through any failure of courage or spirit, but through simple industrial mathematics, appeared consistently in late-war Japanese accounts. It wasn't defeatism in the traditional sense. Many soldiers continued fighting with remarkable determination even after understanding that defeat was inevitable. But the psychological burden of fighting a war already lost, of dying in a cause already defeated, weighed heavily on those who experienced it. The 850 caliber guns on American fighters came to symbolize this reality. They were visible, tangible proof of American industrial superiority. They demonstrated that American factories could afford to equip every fighter with what seemed, by Japanese standards, excessive and wasteful firepower, and that apparent excess, multiplied across thousands of aircraft, created aggregate firepower that simply overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. The lasting significance of American fighter armament in the Pacific War extends beyond simple tactical or technological history. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought, a shift from conflicts decided primarily by soldier quality, tactics, and spirit, to conflicts decided by industrial capacity, logistics, and material abundance. Traditional military thinking, which had shaped Japanese doctrine and training, emphasized that superior spirit and training could overcome material disadvantages. This worked when material disparities were modest, but when one side possessed 10-fold or 20-fold advantages in critical areas, aircraft numbers, ammunition, fuel, industrial production, traditional military virtues, became secondary to industrial mathematics. The 8 machine guns on a P-47 symbolized this shift perfectly. They represented industrial abundance applied to military problems. They demonstrated that American industry could afford to equip aircraft with firepower that seemed excessive by traditional standards, and that this apparent excess created overwhelming tactical advantages when multiplied across thousands of aircraft. For Japanese forces, encountering this firepower was traumatic, not just physically, but psychologically and philosophically. It challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, about what mattered in combat, about how wars were won. The experience of facing American fighters forced a recognition that the war had entered a new phase, where traditional military virtues, while still important, were insufficient against overwhelming material superiority. This recognition appears throughout late-war Japanese accounts, from private soldiers' diaries to senior officers' memoirs. The specific details vary, but the core realization remains consistent. Courage and skill and willingness to sacrifice, while still valued, could not overcome the disparity in industrial capacity that American fighter armament represented. Lieutenant Takada's experience, from his first encounter with P-47 seconds on Okinawa through his capture and post-war life, illustrated this broader pattern. He was a competent officer who led his men as well as circumstances allowed. His soldiers were brave and trained and willing to die for their cause. But none of that mattered against 8 machine guns firing from aircraft that came whenever they chose, attacked whatever they wanted, and departed when they exhausted ammunition that seemed, from a Japanese perspective, limitless. The trauma he carried for decades after the war wasn't just about death and violence. Soldiers can process those experiences, however difficult. The trauma was about helplessness, about facing a form of warfare where everything he'd been taught about military virtue and effective combat became irrelevant. That psychological burden proved more lasting than physical wounds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.